Thank you, everybody who is here for listening to this talk. I'm going to talk about policy. Policy and its relationship with research is a topic that has followed me over my research and professional life. And it's something that really interests me because I think it is about how we as beings can solve collective problems and transit from a state that we can see as something that can be problematic to another scenario which is better, and that process of changing practices is something that has always interested me. Here I'm going to talk about contemporary approaches to educational policy implementation. And I put educational in parentheses on purpose, because even though the concepts, theories, authors that I'm going to address here arises from research conducted in educational settings, I think that many of these conceptual tools also applies to other settings. So if you are not from the educational sector, I invite you that through this presentation, you can try to relate those concepts to your own field. So at the end, we can have our conversation and discussion about what possibilities does these frameworks enable for every one of us. So I'm going to start. Well, what is this presentation going to be about? I'm going to address approaches to educational policy implementation research. And I would also like to tell you how those theories have influenced my doctoral research. Well, as I said, I would like to promote a broader discussion about how do you think that this can resonate in other fields of research and of practice. So if you don't work in a research field that it's about professional practice, maybe anyway, your research unfolds in some organization that may relate to the ideas that I'm going to address here. So I hope that you find interesting. First, just to present a separation between the contemporary approaches to policy implementation from traditional one, I'm going to very briefly explain what are the traditional approaches to policy and policy research. So the dominant scenario in policy research has been the technical rational approach. That is what we all have heard, that is the top-down approach. And from this perspective, policy is located at the government level in all its aspects. So at the government level, there is a definition of what is the problem that we should address, but also a very clear theory about what is the solution to that problems and what means are required to approach it. So there is a very active, thinkful policymaker pole, and implementers are in a position of just implementing in a technical role in regards to the policy, but they don't make decisions. So policy research from this approach is about what policy works and what policy is implementable. And policy failures are conceived as when the result of the policy does not resemble the policy goals. And it's almost always attributed to the implementer's reluctance to pursue the policy goals because there is a misalignment between the interests of the implementers and the interests of the policymakers or the principal. This relates to rational choice theories. But critics to this approach has said that the problem with top-down approaches is that they assume that they can control what happens in all the levels of the organization and all the levels of the policy implementations, which they cannot. And that is how it emerged another traditional approach, which is the top-down or backward mapping, street-level bureaucrats approach, that says that what the implementers' decisions, implementers' actions become the policy as it is perceived and experienced by citizenships. So that policy really is made at the implementators level. And we cannot continue to separate the policy design from the implementation. It's only one process. But this approach, even though it has enabled research to focus on the role of people and its context, still failed to understand in depth what are the relationships, the complex relationships between people participating in policy implementation, the role of the context, how they interact. So that is why they have emerged the contemporary approaches to policy implementation. And they have a variety of streams. All of them are focused on understanding the role of people, policy, and places in making the policy results, the implementation of the policy. So I'm going to address very shortly 4 of them. First one is complexity theory. Complexity theory proposes that in the implementation process, lots of implementers participate in different moments of the implementation process, each one of them embedded in their own context, so that the policy result is something that is unpredictable because it's the result of this complexity. Another contemporary approach is sense-making. And sense-making, what they say is that even though implementers may be willing to do the policy mandate, may be willing to implement the policy as it was designed, sometimes they understand it differently. So each one of the implementators can understand something different in the policy mandate, so that their cognition, their beliefs, their motivations regarding the policy, how they analyze what is their expectation that it's posed over them, and what that is saying about their own practice can vary, and that affects also the policy result. Co-construction also relates to the sense-making, but it adds the power element, because not everyone in the implementation process has the same level of power, the same position in the system to influence what is going to be the sense-making of the policy, the interpretation that is going to be pursued. And also social variables that relate to power, such as gender, social class, race, etc., participate in this process of sense-making, thus affecting the policy result. And finally, enactment theory also builds in the previous ones in saying that implementators has to make an interpretation of the policy mandate, but in base of that, to construct a narrative of what that mandate means for their own practice in their setting, so they can put the policy into practice. So enactment is about translation, interpretation of the policy mandates, and translation into concrete practices in the organization. So research from contemporary approaches to policy implementation is about identifying the mechanisms, the underlying mechanisms, the patterns, the regularities within the interactions of people, places, and policy to form policy and policy implementation. So I'm going to present you now with the framework. This takes all the 4 streams that I already addressed and a lot of different authors. At the end of the presentation, I have provided some references and a wider bibliography if you're interested, because I cannot quote here all the authors that are participating, but the main idea is that policy implementation is about the relationship between the policy design, the people, and the context. But also, in the policy design, it matters the justification of the policy. What is the definition of the problem and the theory of action that to solve the problem? And what are the interests participating in that definition of the problem and the solution. Also the policy goals, and not only the content of the goal, but also if they are narrow or rather broad goals, their time framework, their relationship with the core of the teaching practice, all of those aspects are going to influence the policy results. The strategies of the policy is also relevant. How the policy defines mechanisms for the goals to be achieved, as mandates that can be enforceable, or symbolic leverage to promote change, or inducements as systems of punishments and rewards. At the people dimension, there are the beliefs of people. People beliefs about how education or the purpose of the organization should be influence the result of the policy. Their previous experiences are very strong in sustaining people's beliefs. Also their cognition, what they understand that is the policy mandate. And the attitudes, policies that relate or create a positive attitude in people may be pursued more consistently than policies that trigger negative attitudes in the implementers. For example, if they threaten their professional images. In relation to the context, it matters the situated context. In a case of a school, the territory in which it is located, the characteristics of the intake, the culture. Also the institutional context, where this organization, these schools, is in the system structure. So what are the mandates and the expectations of the school administrator, for example. Social trends can affect policy result. Let's say coronavirus, and stop with talking about social trends, just to identify how the way that schools implement a policy may vary and be affected by things that are happening at the social level. Also interacting policies, other policies that are being implemented in the schools. We know that schools are a very crowded place for policy implementations. So different policies that are not necessarily consistent in their goals or in their mechanisms can coexist within the same school, affecting the results of both policies. And finally, the organizational context. This is the capacity of the school and the human capital, but also the social capital, the relational trust that a school has, its physical and infrastructure resources, the times and the structures they have, the tools they have to work out the policy goals. All those aspects are going to influence. So having presented the framework, I would like to tell you how this have influenced my own research. Well, my research is about policy enactment, and it's about the enactment of the system of education quality assurance in Chile. This policy interests me a lot because in the law, in Chile, in the Chilean law, the purpose of education is defined in a very broad way. It's a lifelong learning, it's a lifelong process that aims not only at creating a future better economy, both for society and for the individual, but also to promote democracy values and create citizens, and also to enable people to develop as subjects and to live meaningful lives. So this is translated into two types of educational goals in the policy. One type is focused on knowledge, and the other type is focused on social and personal skills. Well, the thing is that these two types of goals are merged in making schools' performance categories, which range from high performance to insufficient performance. And these categories are related to consequences for the school. that also can range from prestige, enrollment, and therefore economic funds, to schools that could be closed if it continues to present bad results. But in making this, so we have a high stakes accountability system, but it's not only considering learning results, as is the traditional system, but also these life skills, these personal and social skills. But in measuring a school quality, both type of results don't participate equally. And students' attainment in standardized tests weighed 67% of the final performance category, while the social and personal skills indicators, that are answers in a questionnaires provided to families and students, along with other indicators, weighed 33%. So this interested me because the policy in itself sounded to me a little bit contradictory. So reading about policy and engaging with these contemporary approaches to education, I really became interested in knowing what is the implemented version of this quality assurance reform. So in the practice, in the enacted version of the reform, what are the educational goals that schools are pursuing? And to what extent they are motivated by aspects of the policy design, but also of the people and the context. So this is a summary of my framework. In the left hand, I don't know if it's also the left hand in your screen, but the colorful part is the policy interpretation. So I have in red these dimensions related to context, in green the ones related to people, and in blue the ones related to the policy. And in my conceptual framework, this interpretation of the policy mandates should or might generate a sense of dissonance with current practice that enables or motivates change. So to observe what is the enacted version of this policy, I'm using educational change frameworks that are summarized or represented in this triangle. So what I'm doing is to go to schools, or I already did that in my fieldwork, and observe their organizational routines, their meetings, their documents, in order to see how they are working out the policy goals and see which of them are becoming enacted or at least prioritized. So I would like to show you, just for you to see how this look in the data, some quotes. So I'm going to go to the cognition. This is a quote from a school leader. I changed the school's names for confidentiality process, but I would allow you with a couple of seconds to read it. Well, if you see, this school leader clearly says that she thinks that the expectation that the policy places over the school is to achieve in the standardized tests only, okay? So you can start thinking how this is going to implement the process of school change motivated by the policy. Now look, this is another school, and this is also a school leader addressing the strategy of the policy. And this is a very powerful quotation that I selected on purpose because there are not always this clear, but this is very saying, this is very telling about how they are perceiving the measurements related to educational quality. So you can see that, as this quotation shows, everything else that a child brings to the educational process, but it's not measured by this SIMSE test, equals to 0. See? So you can start understanding how this policy is going to unfold in our schools. Just a final quotation about the sense of contradiction. This is from a middle leader, a teacher leader in another school. This quotation shows that they are indeed analyzing the results and reflecting on their practice, but they are not considering everything that is measured, but only the tests that shows student learning. So, as you may be already guessing, of course, there is variation across the school settings. I'm studying 4 school cases, but roughly speaking, what happens is that schools prioritize and change their structure and dedicate their meetings and produce documents to couple their instructional practice to meet the policy goals, while the social and personal skills are addressed but shallowly and in a way that doesn't touch instruction, classroom instruction. So after having told you that, these are some reflections or some notes taken from the literature. These are not mine, to say to what extent can research inform practice? Because if we're saying that it's so dependent on people and context and their interpretation of the policy mandates, then how can we produce change at a large scale, which is one of the questions that I would like us to discuss. So what the authors have said, for example, by showing that policy variation is an inevitable result of policy implementation. Also, other authors, as Bienet and Pont, they have built policy implementation frameworks based on these theories to be followed by policymakers. Others, as Fulan, have said that he doesn't think that you can have like a checklist to be followed, but it is key that policymakers have this understanding of how policy works and the aspects that influence that, so they can plan better the strategies and the monitoring process of a policy. Also that, and this is Honig who proposed that if we studied these aspects in a wide set of educational contexts and settings, we can come out with some patterns and regularities or underlying mechanisms that can explain the policy implementation results. And that also can inform policy making. Also, for policymakers themselves, that if they want to address change, they need to create this sense of dissonance and also to enable collective sense making within schools so that dissonance can produce something, a change in practice. And finally, by fostering the creation of organizational routines in schools or in the organizations and tools in which the policy can be worked out. So this doesn't happen in a vacuum, but it needs very concrete tools and mechanisms to work practice and to work the change in practice.